All right. Well, good evening. What a pleasure to be here in this intimate room. I'm told that this is the very first event ever to be held in this brand new room. Is that right? That's right, Lucas. Okay. And because and I know a lot of you. It's wonderful to look out at the crowd. We're scheduled to have some time for discussion, but I feel like let's have even more. Like, because this is, it's usually very different. You're far away from people. So tonight we have an incredibly interesting author and book. To introduce him, because my goal, I want everyone in the room to come away with a much better understanding of what the hell is happening to our country, of the political ramifications and the story that begins a while ago, not just in the last few years. And Thomas's book is absolutely essential for that. So I'm going to open with a quote from Spinoza. He says, "I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, not to hate them, but to understand them." And that's the quote that I put at the beginning of my book, The Righteous Mind, because morality sucks you in and makes you hate, and when that happens, you close your mind, and then you can't figure things out, and that's what's happening to us. In a culture war, Newton's third law doesn't hold. That's for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. But in a culture war, for every action there's a disproportionate and opposite reaction. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight, is really to understand the ping pong, the ways that the left and the right became more extreme, more illiberal, and that, I think, is what brought us to this moment. And that's what Thomas's book is amazing at, because 2020 was this historic, pivotal, bizarre, frightening, weird year. And Thomas, a lot of us want to just forget it, but Thomas is like, no, we got to dig in. We got to understand this. Now Thomas is particularly interesting because he has long stood. He is a true principled liberal, which means that he is politically homeless, as many of us are, and has long stood. I think you always assumed. Well, we'll get to your. I'll let you speak for yourself in just a moment. But just to be someone in the middle who gets attacked from both sides, and it's funny the sort of mixed reviews in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times both were sort of like criticizing for like opposite things. So that indicates you're probably doing it right. And so I think the way that I thought we would do this, because so I'm a social psychologist, and I think a lot about persuasion and storytelling. And we think in stories, and when something is laid out in a story, it's very easy to sort of to incorporate new ideas, to incorporate it, and it changes your thinking. So I want to do two stories. I'm going to have Thomas, first I'm going to have him walk through his personal political evolution. What's your personal political autobiography? Like, how did you come to have the interesting politics that you have now? And a little bit about your background and how that shaped your later thinking. So we'll do that more briefly, and then we'll tell the story of America. And I think we'll see. We haven't checked this, but I think we'll see that Thomas's story is going to intersect with the story of America in ways that will, I think, make the book much clearer. Like, why did he write this book? How is it that this guy wrote this amazing book? So Thomas, tell us how you became you. When did you start thinking that you were on the right or the left or a Democrat or Republican? Like, go back to your childhood, teen years, whatever.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Lucas and John. It's an honor to be here in conversation with you. You're one of the thinkers that has really made me appreciate that ideas really matter and that they still can affect culture and society. And so that's an enormous gift you give us all. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I see a lot of familiar and friendly faces, and it's really cool. I'm an elder millennial, as we just were saying in the green room. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in many ways a simpler country. I think a more straightforward country, even if it was a country that I think got some notions of identity very wrong in retrospect. But I have a white mother, and I have a father who's categorized as black in this country and descended from African slaves. And for me, that was a very straightforward identity growing up in New Jersey. I was black because I was, it was not until I was 19 years old in the year 2000 that there was even the option on the census to check more than one box. Race was kind of bizarrely simplified. If you had any black and you were black, and the conversation was kind of over. And it made it very easy for me to really not question how race and identity is made in this country. And it was really when I was out of college and in my 20s, living in New York City, really not thinking very critically about racial identity or things like this, that Barack Obama arose on the political scene and really captured my imagination and presented to me a vision that was so attractive that I think was also, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say it was extraordinarily attractive to a large segment of this country. He showed us that race has been with us and has been in many ways painful for many of us, but that it might in fact be possible to transcend racial categorization and division. And it sounds woefully naive right now to say, but he painted a picture that I really bought into of a kind of post-racial American future. If we weren't there yet, we were certainly pointed in the right direction. And I've spent a lot of my adult life living in Europe. And it was really intoxicating and thrilling to be an American in Europe when Obama was coming on the scene. I mean, he was inspirational not just in the domestic context. He drew a crowd of 200,000 in Berlin, and in Paris, where I lived, people would say, America gets so much wrong, but this could never happen here. Look at how America can correct itself. And so I really, I began to, that coincided, by the end of Obama's term, that coincided with me becoming a father in France and realizing that, I hadn't thought very hard about it because I just did accept that a drop of black blood makes a person black. I realized that I might very well have a child who has more than a drop of black blood in them, but that no one in this world will be able to recognize shares the racial identity I take for granted. In other words, I had a child that very much presents physically as uncomplicatedly white. And it forced me to begin to question some of these assumptions. I would find myself trying to explain to people in France why a drop of black blood makes a person black, and I found myself kind of ventriloquizing the ideas of the slaveholder, and and basically saying that in effect whiteness is a pure state, and it started to lose its kind of persuasive power over me even before my daughter was born. And then once she was there, I realized that I didn't want to keep reproducing these ways of seeing and thinking. This was in 2013. And this is right around the moment that you situate so well in the coddling of the American mind. This is the moment that things started to really change culturally and politically in this country. And this is also the moment that, as I was unlearning race, it seemed like all of the institutions and the mainstream culture in American life was rushing towards an embrace of identity and racial identity specifically, and thinking that that's the only lens through which we can judge all manner of issues. And so I felt myself really diverging from where the American political story was going just at this moment in 2013.
Oh, interesting, right, because you're off in France at that time. So just fill in two things. One is, how did you get from New Jersey to France? How did you come to live there and marry and have a child?
I mean, it's just one of these stories. I was a terrible French student, and to graduate, I had to rush to France to take some extra classes one summer, and you just meet American people, American men usually, but also American women in France constantly, who you go to France and you end up falling in love with some French person, and then your life is entangled in France forever. I came back to school, started dating my French TA. Next thing I know, I'm living in the north of France. We're broken up, and I'm just there, but I'm just stranded in the north of France on the border with Belgium, and it's raining every day. But I fell in love with the country and the culture. Now I got French kids.
Okay, and then also just fill in, in college, were you a Democrat? Were you active in any sort of politics? Just give us your sort of your political bio here.
No, I didn't think very hard politically in college. I was a kid truly from the provinces. I was a kid from New Jersey who, got to Georgetown and fell in love with reading philosophy and things like this, and reading Tolstoy, and realizing the world was so much larger than my own backyard. And I was intellectually high all the time, but on these books and ideas, but I wasn't thinking politically about the society I was living in. I just kind of accepted the mood, the political mood around me, which was George W. Bush is bad, and we should probably invade Iraq, though. And I didn't think very hard about these questions until later, after undergrad.
Oh, no, okay, so that's very illuminating. So you're sort of a
Always voted Democrat, though.
okay, but you're sort of like a dreamy intellectual rather than a partisan. Like you weren't on a team, you were attracted to certain ideas. And okay, so now we have. And what do you call yourself now?
I'm something that doesn't get a lot of props these days. I think of myself as a liberal. Everybody hates liberals. Everybody seems to, everybody except my man David Greenberg, everybody hates liberals. You certainly get no love from progressives if you identify as a liberal. And the people who are generating the cultural shift right now think liberals are weak, and even if they agree with them on certain things, don't think that they get the job done, right?
Okay, all right, so this is a good transition then to the political history, because of course when you say liberal, in America we think liberal means left, but in the rest of the world they don't. You can be a right liberal or a left liberal, and we're part of the liberal tradition, and I teach in a unit at NYU, and it's liberal arts, so I think what you say is perfectly coherent. And so how is it that being a liberal is now somehow not welcome on either side? So just walk us through now how America goes from, so you were first sort of came to consciousness in the 90s. For me, it was the 70s and into the 80s, but then the 90s I experienced as like, oh my God, we did it. We got through the Cold War. We have a balanced budget. I mean, it was like...
Remember that?
I remember. For like 10 minutes, we had a balanced budget. Crime is plummeting. I mean, it was an amazing decade. So walk us through how we get from there to the hellhole craziness that we are now. I shouldn't use the word hellhole. That is a loaded word. But yeah, how did we get here?
I'm really concerned in the book with a recent history, with the past 2 decades, and that's always fraught to look at recent history. But it seems to me that there was an extraordinary amount of disillusionment that followed the Obama moment on both the left and the right. Barack Obama did not bring about this kind of post-racial American society that many of us had really been enthralled by the possibility of. It didn't come about, and I think there was a great amount of frustration on the left that you can directly trace into the kind of social justice movements that started to dominate the 2010s. This also coincides with one of your areas of expertise, which is the technological component of everything. For the first time, we're doing our politics together, surveilling each other's positions and advertising our own, signaling our own virtue in this kind of panopticon of judgment where we're both the prisoner and the guard. So that's happening at the same time that this disillusionment is blooming.
You're both the prisoner and the guard. I love that. That's right.
Yeah, it's really, you're playing both roles, right? And then Trump emerges on the scene and it becomes the kind of focal point for a lot of this this feeling that not only is America not post-racial, but in fact it's intractably white supremacist and rigged. And then on the right, there's an enormous amount of disillusionment and a sense that the kind of progressive cultural dominance disrespects whole swaths of the country and prioritizes all kinds of minority groups at the expense of the J.D. Vancian mainstream or something like that. And so I think that this decade was really pivotal in this kind of increasing polarization. And it's, I really think that maybe the largest component of it might be the technological aspect. I don't think we're all supposed to be constantly talking to each other. I think that's really been proven.
So here I'll jump in, and not surprisingly, I'll say, yes, I think you're exactly right, that the technology changed the culture in ways that are severely damaging a generation and our liberal democracy. So I'll chime in with my observation, which was, around 2012, 2013, especially when Obama was reelected, it seemed to me like, wow, this America, I was born in 1963 when it was still legal to discriminate against, like, black people couldn't do certain, that was during my lifetime. And then every decade, the progress that we'd made on race, sex, LGBT, the progress is incredible. And, by the time you get to 2012, 2013, and then all the gay marriage, almost all of them passed in 2012, it felt to me like, wow, this is like the world that progressives wanted. At this point, if you're progressive, you should be saying, yay, America, whatever we've been doing, let's keep doing it.
Right.
But that's exactly when we switched. That's exactly when we stopped doing it. And I think the only way to explain that, the main way to explain it, is the technological change. So what I experienced as a college professor was all of a sudden in 2014, there was a glitch in the matrix. And the students in our classes were not like what we thought college students were. We thought they were all millennials. We didn't understand that if you're born in 1996 or later, you went through puberty with a smartphone and social media, you came out different. You grew up being, even in middle school, you're the guard and you're the prisoner. And this changes the way you do politics. This changes the way you do relationships. This changes how you get prestige. You get prestige by capturing something on a video and making it go viral. And so I perceived it really was like a glitch in the matrix in 2014, and weird stuff started happening. And then Greg Lukianoff came to me and said, John, weird stuff is happening. And he had a whole explanation about how it's reverse cognitive therapy, and that was true. And when we wrote The Coddling the American Mind, we had like one page on social media because we didn't know that it was what was causing it. But we thought, the timing is right. But since then, I've come to see that this technology is changing almost everything about our relationships, where we get status and prestige. I just heard yesterday a podcast from Cal Newport. If you've ever heard of the Flynn effect, where every decade people are getting, the IQ is literally going up. Until 2012, it reversed in 2012. We're getting stupider now. And everything changed. We're not able to pay attention. We don't read books. So anyway, my point is, what you just told us was more like about America's changing ideas of race, which then led to an understandable backlash on the right. So that's one thread, is our evolving racial understandings, and your disappointment that the high hope in the Obama years was dashed later on. So that's one strand, and then technology is another strand.
May I add one thing based on what you just said?
Let's put it all out there. What are the things we need to work with on the table?
In addition to the technological aspect that you laid out, you made this point that things kept incrementally improving, and why weren't people saying, let's just keep doing what we're doing? And the explanation for this that makes the most sense to me is the Tocqueville paradox, or this one of the truly great observers of American life was Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote in 1856 in L'Ancien Régime, in the Revolution of the Ancient Regime. He wrote that the areas in France where the strongest revolutionary elements were not the most downtrodden. They were, in fact, the areas that were doing the best. And so there's a kind of way in which greater and greater equality actually engenders or provokes more and more powerful reactions against any perceived inequality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. I think we saw that on campus, and that's what microaggressions are about.
Yes,
There's
exactly.
a famous sociology paper on that. Okay, so we have all these things happening in American history, political history, and technology. That brings us up to 2019. And your book focuses on 2020. So just now walk us through how did things come together? How did things explode? What happened in 2020, and how is that shaping where we are today?
Well, the thing that fascinated me so much about 2020 was that there were so many ideas in circulation that suddenly broke through, but were not new. They had been in circulation for decades even, critical race theory and things like this. Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote the definitive critique, in my mind, against CRT in 1993 in the New Republic. These ideas had been around for quite some time, and ideas about gender and stuff had been circulating for quite a long time, had been on Tumblr and places for years.
Right, Tumblr, yeah.
but suddenly they really broke through and took hold of the mainstream in 2020 for I think a confluence of reasons. Again, the technological component, we're all together looking at the same mediated reality on our phones, and we're all having the time to do this because of the pandemic, because we're all out of work or out of school, we're quarantined, and we don't have anything to do, but we have a kind of urge to rebel that expressed itself on the right in rebellions and protests against stay-at-home orders. And then we had this tinderbox moment where this horrific killing took place in Minneapolis. And it wasn't just like the shooting videos that we had seen. It was really, it was like a kind of, like a horizontal crucifixion, you know? It was agonizing to watch, and we all had the time to watch it. And we all were watching our phones. And that coincided with this need to rebel against something. And suddenly, there was permission to rebel against that from one day to the next. You were not supposed to be in the streets unless you were, a grandma killer, Trump voter, And then you suddenly had permission from over 1,000 public health officials that, in fact, racism is also an epidemic, in fact, is a pandemic, and you should be in the streets protesting against that pandemic, and you certainly shouldn't tell anybody that they can't be. And that, I think, broke people's minds. It did. The double standard, I think, is still something that people on the left underestimate. This kind of way that authorities glibly reverse themselves at will based on a moral clarity that allowed them to know what was in fact dangerous or not dangerous, what was right, what was not right, what was justified, what was not justified. While people were literally, we have to remember, a lot of this stuff is willfully memory hold, or it's just too unpleasant to think about, but people missed their parents' funerals. Some of my friends didn't get to bury their fathers, truly. So people were giving up a lot, and then they were seeing that if you had the right politics, or if your moral clarity was intact, then you could do what you wanted. And so that kind of set a tone. And then it was the continuous rioting and looting that was also in the institutions we look to for guidance, in the authoritative spaces, like in the New York Times and places, and on CNN, the famous kind of the reporter standing in front of a building ablaze, saying that, and the Chiron reads, yeah. And he's like, he's sitting there telling you as his skin is melting that these protests have basically been peaceful, except for this factory behind me that absolutely emblazoned. So this was kind of the context that some of these ideas were now competing in all of our consciousness, and everybody was weighing in. And then, the other component of it was that we had this election looming large, and this was an election that, now I think people would revise their judgment, but at the time, that was the most important election in American history, and liberal democracy itself was on the line, and fascism was coming to America, and so everything took on a kind of importance and gravity that was heightened.
All right, so we have, we have converging in 2020. Converging in 2020, we have COVID, we have the Trump administration and the election, we have the new technology. Let's just also bring up more clearly cancel culture, because it seems to me one of the most astonishing facts about the last election was that in every election you get shifting coalitions. Some groups move one way, some move another. And the astonishing thing to me about the last presidential election is, according to the polls, almost every group moved towards Trump, except for black women. But even black men, I believe, moved a little bit. The biggest movement was Hispanics and Hispanic men. But the point is that this wasn't just like, white people wanted Trump and non-white people wanted Harris. This was somehow the Democrats had pushed everyone away from every group. And this, I think, is absolutely crucial to understand. Right now, I share your view that what's happening now in this country is an authoritarian takeover. I mean, it's like textbook. It's really terrifying. And yet, the Democrats have no real alternative. They have no power. They're not, even as Trump has been falling in the polls, they're not rising. So the Democrats are in an incredible state of deficit. There's something they're not seeing. And I think we have to go back to cancel culture to explain how they just alienated so much of the country. And it begins with the example Thomas just gave of that famous public statement from 1,000 public health workers that, right, you can't bury your father, but you should come out and protest against racism. That is something everybody on the right knows, they talk about. And it was this sense of the elites are hypocrites, they're oppressing us, they're sitting comfortably at their laptops while we have to go out and work. So just go further with on cancel culture, because Thomas is one of the originators of the Harper's letter, which now might seem like a historical footnote, but at the time it was like the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. I mean, it was like, wow, someone's actually going to stand up and say something about this, and it was So actually, you tell, how did it start, and what was the core idea?
Well, only one of my brothers is here tonight, David Greenberg, but there were 5 of us who were emailing in these days at the end of May and in June of 2020, just kind of talking to each other and venting, and it was another of our friends, Robert Worth, who began drafting a letter. We had seen multiple instances of institutions that we cared about capitulating to outrage mobs, usually whipped up by fake outrage online on social media, on Twitter and stuff like that. And if you remember, the context at the time was that, like, after George Floyd died, Senator Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, in which he expressed an opinion that certainly can be pushed against, can be contradicted, but that was aligned with more than 50% of the country, according to Gallup polls, that where protests were turning into looting and rioting, if police couldn't restore order, then the National Guard should be sent in. And he did make a distinction between nonviolent protest and looting and rioting. And this ran in the New York Times under the editor, James Bennett, and within, I don't know, the same day that it was published, you had a flurry of kind of highly coordinated tweets from high-profile reporters and journalists at the New York Times saying a kind of copy and pasted statement saying, running this op-ed puts black and brown New York Times reporters' lives at risk, essentially, paraphrasing. Which is a kind of extraordinary thing to say, and it actually takes you out of the realm of disagreeing with a point of view, and it gets into a kind of HR matter about safety and stuff. And at first, the organization, the executive editor at the time defended. The New York Times has published op-eds by people like Adolf Hitler. The New York Times has published op-eds by Vladimir Putin. The New York Times has published op-eds by lots of different points of view. But within days, James Bennett was forced out, and that seemed really unfair. And so that was one of the situations that was, I think, on our minds, and we just decided that we should write a statement just saying that, Donald Trump represents a real threat to freedom of expression, but also a kind of censoriousness is creeping into our institutions from the left, and that we should actually all be willing to advocate for a culture of maximal tolerance and even grace, extending grace even when we think somebody's made a mistake. It was famously an anodyne statement, 3 paragraphs, and kind of the brilliance of it, what David was so good at doing especially, was bringing in many, many people to in addition to the wordsmithing, was bringing in so many different people to sign it, including you.
We had about
153 at the time, yeah.
Especially center left to center right, but there were some people really much more far left as well.
Noam Chomsky, Cornel West. There was a real range of people who signed it, but it sparked outrage, not for what it said, but for who signed it, which kind of proved the point that, Jennifer Finney Boylan, who was a New York Times columnist at the time, and I believe is the president of PEN America now, immediately apologized for signing it and said, like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I had thought Gloria Steinem and Noam Chomsky were signing it. I had no idea that J.K. Rowling and Barry Weiss were signing it. I'm so sorry. The fault is all mine. And Malcolm Gladwell responded quite rightly. He said, I signed the thing because I knew people I disagreed with also were signing it. I thought that was the point of the thing, is that we could find some common values we agreed on. But it was a really weird time.
But it was just such a clear statement of what it means to be a liberal, not to be on the left, but to be a liberal, because everybody who signed it, we were all in the ideas business. We were all, journalists, writers, and it's right for that statement to have provoked outrage. So, okay, so that was really the peak. Cancel culture. Andrew Sullivan had an amazing essay in 2018 that said, the title was "We All Live on Campus Now." And the things that Greg Lukianoff and I were writing about and warning about, and trigger warnings, safe spaces, microaggressions, I had to teach on eggshells for many years. It's fine now, but there were years where I really felt like one wrong move and there.
Oh yeah.
So that period, that 2020 is where everybody understood that we all live on campus now. When he said that in 2018,
Yes.
most people still hadn't necessarily encountered it. By 2020 and the aftermath, and then once it goes corporate, once you get all the corporations having mandatory DEI statements, so just trace that out for us, and then we'll turn to 2025.
Well, when Sullivan said that in 2018, you could still hear that common reaction that was like, yeah, and then they'll get in the real world and they'll see.
Exactly.
And then by
They
2020,
can't do this at Google.
yes,
Yes, they can.
They could do it at the New York Times. They could do it at Google. They could. The real world was bending to the campus culture. Yeah, and you had these, DEI became the coin of the realm, and you had, enforced speech. You had kind of litmus tests. If you wanted to teach physics in certain universities, you had to sign diversity statements about what you would do to, what you would do to foster greater diversity in physics. You maybe have no experience with that. You're not a sociologist. You don't know anything but how to teach physics, but you had to commit yourself to that program. It was an enforced viewpoint, and I think that the Raymond Aron quote that really sticks out to me about communism, but all kind of progressive utopian movements, and I think it applies to wokeness, is that it's refuted far more by its successes than by its failures. A lot of these goals of the movement were actually put into effect. And as soon as they were put into effect, you could see that it was already setting the table for the extraordinary backlash that we know now has come. But I think that it's still surprising the degree to which the backlash is so relentless, and the degree to which a lot of people feel that the correction, it's not an overcorrection, that the correction hasn't even happened yet. I've been really surprised by that, but people seem to genuinely believe that. And I think if you've been through the experience of having to sign a statement you don't believe in, I think that you probably never get over that, And that happened in different ways across the country and in a lot of workspaces. Just to share, a minor anecdote, when I was shopping this book, one of the reactions an editor gave me was that they wanted the book because they were furious that they had to sit through. They were forced to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, and they lived their whole life not being white and understanding how to be an anti-racist, what racism was, and they were forced by the company they worked for to have to read it. And as a black man, that stayed with them. And people were, I think, people really affected by the kind of authoritarian. There's a kind of idea that authoritarianism only comes from the government, but in fact, as John Stuart Mill pointed out, there's even more pernicious forms of authoritarianism that work informally. The social tyranny is more it's more pervasive than what the government can do. It's your neighbors, it's the people that are watching you on Twitter and everything.
Right. There's a psychological term, reactance. Reactance is sort of the angry desire to sort of push back, or if someone tells you to do something, you want to do the opposite, and so of course the DEI in the corporate world had that effect, and it often backfired for that reason. And I think what we saw, and I think a lot of people don't understand just how the COVID response from the public health officials, of course, the hardcore scientists did amazing with the vaccines, but the people in charge of public health were sort of authoritarian and not based on evidence, and they never walked things back when they said things that were wrong. And so I think to understand where we are, we have to look back and see, why is it that so much of the country doesn't trust scientists and experts? Well, because they behaved in a certain way and lost the trust. So in our final few minutes before we open it up for questions, let's focus on 2025 and 2026. And I'd like you to muse on, you can take your choice, either what you think the Democrats would need to do to become a functioning opposition party. I shouldn't put it that way, but there's a huge question, as there has been for since 2004. What's the message? What's our messaging? No, it's not messaging. It's the message. It's anyway. So either the Democrat or just sort of or liberalism. And again, liberalism does not mean the left. I mean, we have so many great intellectual friends who are on the right but are true liberals. So take your choice: Democrats or liberalism.
Well, I mean, both are very interesting for me. But in terms of Democrats, I think. What they would have to do, and if my experience publishing this book is anything, I'm not sure there's a great will yet. One of the reactions that has perplexed me the most is this kind of response where somebody says, there's no point in looking at anything that maybe there were some excesses in the past, but that's pointless now. It's all moot now because the only thing going on is Donald Trump, and that's the only thing we should be paying attention to, and we should really not punch left at all. Just attack Trump. And it's really real TDS hasn't been tried yet. We should just double down on more TDS, and then that's going to get us to turn the corner. You're going to finally get the country to come around that way. No, the Democrats have to figure out how to have an attractive vision. As bad as Trump might do in the polls, the Democrats do worse. They're in the 30s or something like that. And that vision would, I think these two questions are actually entwined. That vision would have to somehow be a recommitment to liberal values. And what are liberal values? That due process matters, that the individual shouldn't be subordinated to the group, that the individual dignity matters, that viewpoint diversity matters, and that tolerance of diverging viewpoints is a good. And also that compromise and negotiation matter, that politics is not zero-sum, and it's not to beat your enemy or opponent into outright submission, but it's to find a way to actually flourish together, because there are no permanent victories in the culture war. In fact, the pendulum always does swing back, even if it is held on one side for a while. It will inevitably swing back, and the weapon that you're wielding now can be eventually picked up and used on you by your opponent, and they'll remember. So I think liberals and Democrats have to find a way to, I think you can only make a new vision attractive if you take stock of what was so unattractive about what you were previously doing. And I think part of why they can't gain traction is that it doesn't feel that enough of them are genuinely articulating why what happened before was wrong, why there is some justification in the rejection of it, even if the rejection of it now has gone so far that it's become a wrong of its own. It didn't come out of nowhere. The reason why Trump was able to be redeemed and reelected is inextricable from what people found so unattractive about where the Democratic Party under Joe Biden had been, and how Kamala Harris represented a continuation of that.
Okay, well, I think that's a beautiful place to end our presentation. Thomas just put forward a set of principles that I think almost all Americans, at least in the abstract, would endorse. And this is what has made liberal democracies the greatest societies the world has ever known. So now I want to take questions, but I just want to have a little preface, which is this. I've always been very, very aware that in most sort of intellectual spaces, there's a sort of an underlying assumption that everyone's on the left, and this is a conversation among progressives and that sort of thing. And I noticed that in my own field in social psychology in 2011, and I saw how that damaged our ability to think, and that's what led me to found Heterodox Academy and to really come to just especially adore John Stuart Mill and On Liberty. And so I'm usually very careful, especially if I'm up on a stage, to not to not be judging either side. And obviously, I share with Thomas the view that what's happening now is an authoritarian takeover, and so that might have conveyed the sense that, there they go again, the liberals, because they're in a group like this. I'm willing to bet most people, the great majority of Democrats, but there are a number of Republicans for sure. There are libertarians. There are people who voted for Trump, and part of the theme of Thomas's work here is you really can't understand where we are unless you understand why your opponents did what they did. And it is usually a reaction to something on your side that you don't even acknowledge. And he used the word memory hold. A lot of people want to sort of memory hole all the horrible things that happened in 2020. The decimation of our epistemic institutions, universities, journalism. So anyway, my point is, we're opening up to questions now, and I would especially welcome questions from anybody who wants to challenge this or even defend what Donald Trump is doing. That would be a good thing for us to hear and discuss in a civil way. So I really want to open up to everybody, and let's try to understand you. We're all Americans going through a very difficult time as we approach the 250th anniversary of our country. I guess I'll call on people. So this fellow here made my eye contact first. Go ahead. So if you just stand up, just say your name and then your question. And of course, the usual stuff. Keep it relatively short. Only one question, not a three-part question, and just as long as it ends in a question mark. Go ahead. Okay, please. Good. We should get you a microphone. Wait, do we have a microphone for people in the audience? Is there, or we can, yeah. Well, I think, but I'm assuming there's also there are people watching online as well. So yeah.
So firstly, I loved how you put language to things in that era. I left New York in that chaos and was ostracized. But doing that is brilliant, and you've been a massive inspiration. And people like Rob in the audience and other people have really done work empirically to help us understand that world. But I'm only going to go to something to respond to the sort of challenge of that. So a few things that I think you might be able to relate to. So you always talk about the Americans in this way, instead of thinking about a group of people that should not be shy to assert the superiority of Western values, which have been subsidized by America. And then we always go back to this sort of Democrat-Republic thing, and I'm neither a blood or a Crip, okay? And I wonder if we could consider different ways of looking at this. And always when you say the authoritarian regime, we don't have a counterfactual. And I'd say that you already had a government that was lying through its teeth on both sides, and you can't have the counterfactual. So I'd wonder if either of you would think about this preservation of Western ideals or the baton of liberalism existing somewhere in, let's say, the cloud or something else, or transmuting those things from how it went from Amsterdam to London to San Fran to New York. And that this is where I wonder if people like the intelligentsia that I'm sitting in front of can work with. Have you ever considered working with people that are shaping things in the technologies, because it's had a massive influence on people like me that are trying to, but instead of maybe looking at the authoritarian thing and everything else, looking forward to maybe shape some of these things. And you've already been successful in that with schools that are now not doing that. It's a massive deal. And I think the stakes are a lot bigger than discussing a problem that cannot be solved with Democrat versus Republican, or balance sheets that will never balance.
Okay. Hey, do you want to take it or shall I?
It sounds like it's suited for you.
Yeah, okay. So just that yeah. Okay, so first, so there's a lot to agree with there, a lot that's really interesting. I began writing The Anxious Generation as a book about what technology is doing to democracy, and the fear that if democracy is a conversation, as Noah Yuval Harari says, if it's a conversation, when it moves from what it was in the 20th century onto Twitter, then it's a conversation that perhaps cannot support democracy. That was my fear. And so I'm very interested in that question. How is technology transforming society? I focused on the kids for now, but I'm really interested in what's happening to us democratically. We all agree, whatever, it's changed what's happening. And I've always been of the opinion that, in theory, the internet should be amazing for democracy. And this is what we all thought in the 90s, right? We thought okay, good luck, China. You're never going to keep this out. The people are empowered. So, and I've always thought there is a future in which technology gives us the best liberal in that sense, the best societies that we've ever known. And it might well be a society that is not so focused on national boundaries. So I completely agree with your vision. Now, how do we get there? My fear is that it might be impossible to actually get there, but that's another story. So I would agree with you that Okay, but then where I'll disagree with you is this. I actually think, as a social psychologist who thinks that tribalism is a part of our nature, I think the nation state is the highest we can go. The only way we could go higher is if we have a war with Mars or some other planet, which, of course, thanks to Elon Musk, could happen in 100 years. But I do think that the nation state is very, very important because as tribal creatures, we need something to belong to. We can't just have, and this is, I think progressives are more guilty of, just imagine that there were no countries. It isn't hard to do. Like that vision of the song Imagine, like I think it would never work. It would be a complete disaster. So, okay, we'll have to stop there, but I'm happy to talk with you afterwards because he has lots of books to sign and I only have 3. So you can come talk to me after.
They're just like, that's a handicap for me. They're just tilting the scales,
Okay, next question. Okay, yes. Yeah. Stand up, say your name.
Tess. Camille Foster.
Yes, nice
Howdy,
to
guys.
see you, Camille.
Thank you. I actually want, thank you, Jesse. I want you guys to fight a little bit. What you just said a moment ago was, I'm going to sit down because there are cameras and stuff. What you said a moment ago is that tribalism is perhaps somewhat innate, that there is a scope beyond which we can't go. But I think that the history of mankind has been this kind of project of these expanding circles of concern. And the notion of this liberal project, especially a global liberal project, is one in which we're recognizing that this kind of fundamental notion of human dignity is something that is essential to all other humans, which I think kind of runs afoul of what you suggested a moment ago with tribalism, but more specifically with Thomas's project and a lot of the complicating ideas around identity that he's introducing in his work. I think the aspiration is to get to this notion of individual dignity, which I don't think limits our ability to be members of various groups at the same time and to redefine ourselves and reimagine who and what we are in all sorts of ways. But it's beyond the scope of the nationalist project and beyond the scope certainly of the kind of race and identity project. And I suspect Thomas may have some other thoughts about that.
Yeah,
too.
so let's definitely start with you here. What is your vision? You've been talking about a sort of dreaming of a post-racial society. Would you dream of a post-national society, like what do you? Yeah, what do you?
Yeah,
think?
no, I wouldn't. I tend to think that national borders really matter, and I think that you have to have within the society that's bordered, you have to have a kind of common story and understanding of what your society is fundamentally about that everybody can buy into. And the French have a very good story. It's not perfect, but that's a society that says it's not a blood and soil society. It's actually a society based on ideas and citizenship, and you might be a Jew at home, you might be a Muslim at home, but in public you're a French citizen. And America is an idea and is a creedal nation, and I think the most beautiful phrase is "out of many one." And I think that you can only have that kind of story when there is a defined border. That story, I don't think, can actually. People really are different. When I aspire to a kind of future multi-ethnic society in which your skin color matters to me as much as like your eye color or your hair color, which I think is possible because it's all just pigment, that would not mean that people aren't different and don't come from different places with different values and different worldviews. So I think that you would still have to have a kind of national narrative, even if it were able to transcend physical differences.
Yeah, so you've utterly failed to get us to fight because I'm going to just build a little bit on what Thomas just said, which is, the Righteous Mind, my book, The Righteous Mind, a central idea is that the Bedouin proverb is deeply right and powerful, which is me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me and my brother and cousin against the stranger. That's our tribal nature. But that doesn't mean we have to live in a state of conflict or war, because here's another fact. When you form groups, everyone's heard of the minimal groups paradigm. You form groups, they have more loyalty just for random things. But here's the thing. When you have groups competing with each other, you increase in-group love, but you don't increase out-group hate. Putting people in competition does form team cohesion. And I'm really taken by sociological analyses like Robert Bellah decades ago and Robert Putnam now about the loss of social capital. and how we need groups. And this is Edmund Burke and the little platoons. Like, we need groups nested within groups. And that is building on our tribal nature, but it's incredibly peaceful. Now, not always. So sports is an incredible spur to group cohesion without out-group hate, except in the UK where they get the soccer riots. So it can turn toxic. So that's what I would say. Like, we cannot transcend tribalism, but we can live in ways that give us the positive stuff with none of the violence. We can have an incredibly unviolent society, and we've done that, and Europeans have certainly done that.
Yeah, it's debatable whether they're going to continue doing that, but they have done that. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, thanks, Camille. Let's see. Let's go. Anyone on this side? Okay, I have a little competition here. I mean, these guys are really kicking you. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Camille's on your side. Okay, so we'll go with that fellow over there. Yes, with the glasses. Go ahead. Yeah, you.
Good evening. I'm Anthony, longtime listener, first-time caller, Tom. But I find myself, first off, I teach in Plainfield, so...
Oh, yeah. We've been in contact before, right?
We certainly have.
Thanks for coming.
I find myself stuck between sort of macro, micro all the time on these issues. Like, this is what I feel. This is what I believe. These are the truths. These are the things that we should do. But I have to go to work tomorrow. What do I do about it? And I guess I'm almost asking, like, what do we do? Because I think that is what so many people are especially right now, as we're talking about what's happening with Democrats and sort of this implosion of the party, is what do we do? What does anyone do? Because I think people are completely overwhelmed, and so then like people and objects of power, like Trump's notions and things, become more attractive because at least it's something. So what's the path, and what do people who are just going to work, what do they do? How do they enact change? And how do the Democrats or anyone get back to life?
I mean, yeah, that's not a softball question, but
timer's running. I need an answer because I'm presenting tomorrow at work.
Well, I think that this. I wonder actually if you agree. It sounds like what you're talking about with nesting, but I think that what people really could do that would immediately have an effect if it scaled is really take seriously like going to work in their community, being present in their homes, maybe getting less online and less caught up in kind of national culture war drama. And interacting with people, in my neighborhood, when I go to visit my parents in New Jersey, multiple families around us have Trump signs on their lawns, but they're also, I mean, this is a cliche to say, but they're also like the people that like literally, when my mom had to go to the hospital in the middle of the night, drove my mom. It's an Indian family. It's actually not the cliche of the Trump voter, but it's a kind of, for me, that really impressed me, that you need to know your neighbors and know them beyond kind of the caricatures and actually invest in being in your community, and then that somehow, if more and more people behave that way, it scales up. I think we were talking about this before coming down. One of the worst things that's happened in recent decades is the lack of interest in the local, and the fact that we're all just plugged into national politics as sports culture wars, and you have people who are really riled up about issues that aren't even prevalent in their own communities and at each other's throats over that. I remember when I really understood something was wrong with social media was prior to being active on Twitter, when I used to be on Facebook. I used to work as like a paralegal in my early 20s, and I just, years after leaving that job, I remember just seeing like my uncle by marriage yelling at like the woke girl I worked with 10 years ago at Skadden Arps, and just realizing, and they were yelling at each other about some political issue that really could not have possibly affected either of their personal lives, and they were at each other's throats from different states. And it just seemed to me like that's the most toxic thing that we all are guilty of doing. But if we're more cognizant of that, I think that would do, on some level, some good.
Yeah. I'm going to get to the exact same place, but by a different route, which is, we're a gigantic country with 50 states and a federal government that's not very responsive to anybody unless they're a donor. And so there's really very little that any of us can do to affect anything at the national level or the political level. we can have more impact at the state level and especially at the local level. So that's just sort of the background. And a lot of young people seem to think that their life is only meaningful if they can have an impact or if they can get involved with these full national or global issues. And that often backfires, even when they're effective, it often is counterproductive. So I think the idea of that it's so noble and important to be fighting these national fights, if all you're doing is doing angry stuff on social media, there's a good chance you're part of the problem, not the solution. And so I think what is it that we can do? Well, the reason we're here is because of political polarization. That is, there's a political scientist, I forget his name, he had a paper a few years ago that was analyzing democratic backsliding. You look at all the countries in the world, they're all coded by a couple of organizations, democratic quality from 0 to 10. When is it that a country goes from 8 to 6 or from 4 to 2? When is it that that happens? And at the upper end, it's when you have affective polarization, when each side hates the other. That's when you get democratic backsliding, because when you hate the other side, then the ends justify the means, and it's okay to break the law because those bastards did it and the future of the country. So this was the subject of my second book, The Righteous Mind. I was really alarmed about polarization because this is going to bring us over a cliff. And so Thomas's answer is basically work at the local level. You can do a lot to reduce the polarization. And as citizens of a democracy, if democracy is a conversation, well, the conversation we're having on social media is toxic and polarizing for the most part, but each one of us, when you have the chance, and you can even do it on social media sometimes, when you treat people with grace and understanding, it affects everyone who watches. That, we don't have to just be the bloods and the Crips. So yeah, I'd say act locally. Okay, we'll take this fellow here.
Hi, my name's Michael.
Wait, microphone?
Oh, sorry. Hi. My name's Michael. I find myself sort of feeling this sort of contradiction and sort of hearing what y'all are talking about, and I feel it in myself in my own life. There's this sort of question about what do we do now, or how do we move forward, or what do we do? What do the Democrats do? What do the Republicans do? Whatever. And I think about the fact that on the conservative side, there's, the predominant political power is in Make America Great Again, which is in it is this idea that you want to look backwards, but at the same time, we're in this embedded in that there's an incredible technological push forward. And then sort of on the Democratic side, it's sort of we want to return, I hear from you, Thomas, we want to return to sort of liberal values of the 90s or whatever. But at the same time, I hear Jonathan talk about how the 90s, we were so excited about the progress that we had come through from before. And so I'm sort of curious, what actually is the goal? What is the problem and what is the goal that you even seek, or that quote unquote we even seek? And I ask this to myself because I feel like I'm in a real contradiction of both constantly sort of wanting to go to the past, but also feeling the future is pushing me ever forward towards something. And is that future, is it referred to the past? Is it something, is it a new, sort of reality? I can't quite reconcile the past. And I wonder if sort of liberalism itself might be a sticky fly in the ointment there.
Okay. Do you want to take a crack at it?
I'll take a stab at that. I mean, in this, I feel myself to be my most conservative. I think that you should be very careful about how much progress and how fast you want to make. And if you look around, even as bad as things feel to a lot of people right now, this society is kind of a miracle. Look at this room. It's kind of incredible. We already live in a multi-ethnic society that works very well and provides, the best standard of living that humans have ever had. And, things are pretty astonishingly good if you do change. And I don't mean to be Panglossian about it, but truly, I mean, I often think about this, through personal experience, but it seems relevant to me. My father grew up in an entirely different country than I did. My father's old enough to be my grandfather. He grew up in the Jim Crow South. Incremental progress is real and meaningful, and this is a decent and good society in so many ways, and it's improved upon itself. And I have a kind of conservative element in my personality, maybe, that thinks that you should solidify those gains and really appreciate what is there. And this desire to fully remake society has never been something that has ever been seductive to me. So I really, it's hard for me to understand, just like it's hard for me to understand this desire to colonize a new planet when this planet is really good, and if we treated it well, it would be a great place to live still. You know, like, that's kind of how I feel about this society too. It's like, I don't want a new society. I want to really make this one as good as it can be, and it is pretty good in many ways. I wonder what you think.
No, I take a very different approach to Michael's question, which is about the tension between forward and back, and I see it as the tension between the progressive and the conservative impulses. There's a basic design principle in the human body, in bodies, which is you don't have like a thing that sets a level. You have two things that push in opposite directions, and then they can shift the balance point quickly. So we have the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. We have pairs of opposed muscles. So when you have that, then you can get effective regulation responsive to the environment. And when I started writing The Righteous Mind, I was very much on the left, and I started the book trying to help the Democrats see how they kept screwing up in 2004. But once I read a lot of conservative writings, like the conservative tradition and the conservative intellectuals, I said, wow, there's a lot of wisdom here. And I came to the view that, you know, what we want is not like a state of perfect world peace or harmony. What we want, or what we want that can be achieved, is a society in which the people who have the progressive impulse, Robert F. Kennedy Sr., the progressive impulse to change, to imagine things that never were. We want those people, but my God, if they have total charge, we're going over a cliff. And we want the conservatives. We want the George H.W. Bush. It wouldn't be prudent. We're going to be careful about this. We're not just going to roll out everything, we're not going to roll out social media to our kids and then just see whatever. So we need that conservative impulse. And a good society is one in which you have, I think of as we could say the true liberals. Here you could say true progressives. You have true progressives and you have true conservatives. And unfortunately, what we have now, because of the polarization, the anger, is we have on the left, we have it's illiberal. The far left is not liberal in our opinion, and the far right is certainly not conservative. So that's what I would hope for, is that the future for America would be one where we have a responsible center-right party, which I think we don't have. The Republicans sort of killed off all their moderates in Congress. And the Democrats, while they didn't kill off all their moderates in Congress, but they kind of killed them all off in like every other institution that they could.
That matters.
So yeah. So that's my hope, is that we'll get, responsible progressive, responsible conservatives, and the tension between them will be healthy rather than a war to the death. So we're just about out of time, but we'll take one more question. I did notice we haven't had any women ask a question, so we'll take you. Oh, and also, yeah. Okay.
Mine's pretty simple. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Danielle. Mine's a simple question. How much of this issue do you think is a lack of education? And I guess I'll preface that by saying, so often I hear people talk about our democracy, even people in Congress, and we don't actually know how democracy works. It seems like a social studies issue to me. So wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think that's extremely correct. I think that, we're in a nation where we're arguing about issues that they seem too abstract to a lot of people, right? We talk about things like due process and stuff, and I think that Trump has really found a powerful way of communicating beyond ideas like that, and saying that like drug dealers are bad. What are you talking about? Why are we coddling them with things like this? And that seems to strike a lot of people as quite persuasive. So I think that, that is a bit outside of my wheelhouse. How do you get the American population better educated? But, it's not a new problem. It certainly is, Anti-Intellectualism in America was a bestseller in the 1950s.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll take a very different approach here, and I'll say, I think a lot of the problem is caused by too much education. And here's why. So I will certainly agree that civics education, that learning about how our country works, yes, there should be more of that. So that if that was behind it, then I agree with that. But there's some really interesting findings. When you look at polarization, and affective polarization, hate for the other side, and you plot it out by level of education, what you see is that if you have a college degree or a graduate degree, you're very polarized, and you're probably on the left. But if you're more working class, you're not very polarized. And so in general, what's a culture war is fought, it's not fought by the working class. Culture wars are fought by people with college degrees who are having trouble getting prestige or good jobs. They're the ones who are really out there trying to attack and show off and display. And there's even a really powerful theory by Peter Turchin about why civilizations collapse. There are cycles. And there are three factors that predict civilizational collapse or a down cycle. I think they are popular immiseration. So if there is a lot of hunger and fear and the precariat, and so if the people are not feeling secure is one. Two is public indebtedness. When you have a gigantic debt, that tends to constrain things in ways that lead to collapse. So we got 2 out of 2. And then the third is a surplus of well-educated people who, basically a surplus of well-educated people, because they're the ones who fight culture wars. And if you look at for example, we expect that in a left-wing administration, everyone's from Ivy League schools, but that's kind of the case in the Trump administration as well. A lot of them are Ivy League grads. So the culture war, and David Brooks had a really powerful essay a number of years ago about a More in Common study. When you look at the data, what's happening to us is a civil war fought among rich white people. That's the crux of the culture war. So I don't think that education will save us. I think we need to reform education so that, of course, look, I'm a college professor. I believe education is overall a very, very good thing, but we do tend to breed people who are not good citizens. They're good partisans, and that is really bad for the country and for the Democrats, I'd say. Okay, so I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention. I hope you'll check out Thomas's book. And yeah, good night.